If the CIA was serious about pursuing behavior modification and mind control, then it would need a team of serious investigators to carry out scientific experiments regarding the very mechanisms underlying behavior itself, and thus the mind. And the essential question, is man programmable like a machine? Like a machine? Like a machine?
In watching an electronic data processing system in operation, you are struck by how few people are involved. This impression is misleading. There are more people behind the scenes than first meets the eye.
During the early 1950s, Dr. Hebb had taken part in the CIA's top-secret Project Bluebird, which aimed to develop techniques to get people to, quote, sing like a bluebird, even against their own will. As experimentation continued, Bluebird quickly evolved into Project Artichoke, which in turn evolved into what would become MK Ultra, and subsequent covert projects thereafter. But covert, organized scientific research had already begun years earlier, under the auspices of government committees and private foundations leading up to World War II. Early on, a number of social scientists, psychiatrists, and psychologists were tapped for the Presidential Advisory Committee for National Morale in order to advise the government and military on psychological warfare in anticipation of America's entrance into the war. The Morale Committee conducted in-depth research, much of it classified, into psychological operations and countering enemy propaganda, while ensuring the American public's support for the war through domestic propaganda. The committee also proposed secret research into methods of enhanced interrogation that could be used to make people talk against their will. Channeled through the Office of the Coordinator of Information is what came to be known as the TD, or Truth Drug Project. The Office of the Coordinator of Information would soon merge into the science-based Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, the clandestine wartime precursor to the CIA. These early truth drug experiments would be carried out in secret, but apparently with little success, under the cover that the OSS was attempting to find a cure for shell shock.
Some of the newer trends in the USSR are as follows. A. The adoption of a multidisciplinary approach, integrating biological, social, and physical mathematical research in attempts to better understand and eventually to control human behavior in a manner consonant with national plans.
But the computer continuously and instantly solves the problem and sends the answer to the guns as train and elevation orders.
In May 1942, just a few weeks before the OSS was officially created, a small invitation-only meeting was held on, quote, cerebral inhibition that would change everything. It centered around two topics, hypnosis and the conditioned reflex. The Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation, a private philanthropy tied to the Rockefeller oil empire and later outed as a CIA front during the MK Ultra revelations in the 1970s, would host the meeting. Macy's Foundation president and neurologist Frank Fremont Smith, well connected to an inner core of elite scientific operatives, brought together a cross-disciplinary panel of ranking academics deeply meshed within both the scientific agenda of the major private foundations and the wartime intelligence effort to weaponize science in light of technological advances. Off the record, these people would discuss what could be done about the problem. Chairman Warren S. McCullough, a neurophysiologist at the University of Illinois' Neuropsychiatric Institute, who fancied himself an investigative philosopher of the nervous system in relation to human consciousness.
Special stress is laid on a competent neurological examination.
His cybernetic quest to understand the brain-mind problem would come to be known as second-order cybernetics. Anthropologist Margaret Mead and her husband, social scientist Gregory Bateson, members of the Morale Committee, who would quickly become OSS agents, using foundation and military grants to study cultures at a distance, break down psychology of groups, and design black propaganda. And their upstairs neighbor, Macy's Vice President Lawrence K. Frank, who directed the Rockefeller Foundation Child Development Program and influenced behaviorist changes in public schools that would lead to the federal Head Start program. Physiologist Arturo Rosenbluth of Mexico City, who studied homeostasis in biological organisms under frequent Macy's Foundation collaborator Walter B. Cannon. Rosenbluth's work with math prodigy Norbert Wiener was now on the verge of a breakthrough that would alter our society forever. And psychoanalyst Lawrence Kuby, another member of the Morale Committee who would carry out unethical truth drug research for the OSS alongside future MKUltra contractor George Hunter White.
This man worked on some of these programs. He would write of his work, "It was fun, fun, fun."
Kuby would later reflect on his experiments on prisoners with White, writing, "I look back fondly on those days. What great fun we had." Trained in psychiatry and later as an experimental neuropathologist at the elite Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, Kuby studied under Penfield's mentor, Sir Sherrington at Oxford, where he developed a significant theory that neuroses escalate due to excitation waves that build up tension by cycling through closed loops in the nervous system. The leading topic at the 1942 Macy's Conference was the covert use of hypnosis, presented by FBI asset Milton H. Erickson, a pioneer of implanted hypnotic suggestion, who would later contract with both the OSS and CIA.
I understand you've never been hypnotized. No. Close your eyes. Take a deep breath. Let it seem to you as if many minutes have passed. And you're beginning to learn to go into a trance. That's right. That's right. I want you to go deeper and deeper into the trance.
Though there are no published records from this meeting, psychologist Lawrence Kuby, a key member of the Macy's Conference, wrote about their work together in his 1939 paper on experimental neurosis in man, where he explains how Erickson is able to implant false memories and hypnotic commands into subjects who later display the fearful symptoms of neurosis. Kuby describes how, quote, psychotic emotional storms could be triggered on command by hypnotic cues.
And you do not know the answer to that question consciously.
And an OSS plot to send coded messages through hypnotized couriers.
You can ask a subject to develop an amnesia for certain experiences, or certain classes of experiences, for certain attitudes, for certain learnings. It goes in the hypnotic trance, and you need merely to direct the ideas to which the subject is to respond. Your unconscious mind can forget about it, you know. All you have to do is let things happen.
Hypnosis rolled over into the group's second presentation on the conditioned reflex, presented by psychologist Howard Liddell, who established Cornell University's Behavior Farm Laboratory, where irrational stimulus and response patterns were found to trigger artificial neurosis in sheep and other animals. A devotee of Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, Howard Liddell used the techniques of conditioned response that Pavlov had developed.
I'm myself somewhat of a disciple of Pavlov.
To study the conditions between the central nervous system and emotions. These experiments proved that motivations like hunger could be exploited, and the psychological response to stimulus, whether pain, fear, or reward, could be gamed to create experimentally induced neuroses, which is little different than torture. Like other Macy's attendees, Liddell had been recruited by the National Research Council, which had, with Macy's Foundation funding, formed a number of emergency committees, including a division of anthropology and psychology. It was in this spirit of marrying science and research to efforts in espionage that the meeting commenced. entangled in the secrecy and urgency of the war.
If you are working in a defense-related area, your plant must be a strong island of vigilance amid the potential security threats on every side in our nation's defense against the spy.
But the most important conversation happened in the lunchroom when Arturo Rosenbluth told the other attendees about his work with math genius Norbert Wiener on so-called teleology and goal-seeking devices. As it turned out, the behavior of organisms and machines could be neatly and simply modeled around the feedback loop. Margaret Mead was so riveted that she chipped a tooth, though she didn't realize it until later. She said, recalling the meeting, it was 1942.
When you really had the design of what needed to be done.
Its members dispersed to tend to their roles of wartime scientific research, but the Macy's group would not end there. 10 more Macy's conferences were planned on what the group informally called the Man-Machine Project, a new science of control based largely on Norbert Wiener's work. During the First World War, Norbert Wiener studied artillery fire as a soldier and math expert with what was then primitive equipment.
1 to 4 bursts. Move along the course of your plane, keeping pace with you as the fire control instruments supply predicted firing data constantly. The target sighted, direction, angular height, and altitude readings are taken at several points along its course.
By World War II, Norbert Wiener had automated anti-aircraft artillery fire, along with his partner, electrical engineer Julian Bigelow.
The anti-aircraft gunner cannot rely on dead reckoning. His leading must be a careful mathematical calculation.
It was one of the outstanding achievements of the war, improving accuracy to a science.
Whether tracked by optical sight or by radar, the information is fed by electric cable to a director.
And we now have the basic elements of a differential.
This mechanical quiz kit digests the data and automatically computes the right lead.
The other 2 parts then are inputs. The sum is 6 inches.
It used automatic tracking systems that would make decisions or adjustments based on the feedback of changes in course, speed, or wind.
So they will fire not at where the target is now, but at where it will be.
It was all negative feedback, really. The calculus of the space of what hadn't quite happened yet, like a duck hunter. Wiener's goal-seeking machines would lead the target and time the intersection of the bird and the shot. The potential maneuvers are weighed and considered, then done or not done, like an arm extended to reach for a glass, moving exactly the distance needed in order to grasp it. Intricate activity in the nervous system carries out muscle contractions or muscle inhibitions countless times over, keeping the body on track to grab the water that the mind wants to drink. What if the brain worked like a computer? If so, could it be decoded and reprogrammed?
You could see from this that if you knew when to make changes and what changes to make, you could continuously defeat the predictions.
This rotund and notoriously absent-minded genius had constructed a formula for what he termed cybernetics, a phrase he had coined out of the Greek word kybernetes, or steersman. His 1948 book, underwritten by the Rockefeller Foundation and written primarily for trained scientists, summed up cybernetics as control and communication in the animal and the machine. Its popularity triggered the 1950 follow-up, The Human Use of Human Beings, Cybernetics and Society, dropping the heavy math that outlined a whole new era.
Our first assignment was communication, maintaining the nerve system of the arsenal of democracy. Communication.
It was during these interwar years, and at a confidential meeting in Princeton, that Warren McCullough, in his words, began conspiring with Rosenbluth and Fremont Smith on the interdisciplinary meetings to follow. By the time the Macy's Conference reformed in March of 1946, they knew, in principle at least, that the brain and the computer had a common link in their operating systems. Both work through inputs and outputs, so interface should theoretically be possible. Now, technology from the war had provided a unique opportunity for researching these questions in practical terms.
The outstanding feature, in addition to the interdisciplinary approach, is a new concern for mathematical approaches to an understanding of behavior. Particularly notable are attempts to use modern information theory, automata theory, and feedback concepts in interpreting the mechanisms by which the second signal system, i.e., speech and associated phenomena, affect human behavior.
The first official Macy's Cybernetics Conference was held in March 1946, just a few months before the passage of the National Mental Health Act, which gave the federal government a new mandate, not just to treat, but prevent mental illness, establishing the National Institute of Mental Health. Known during the first 6 meetings by the longer title, Circular Causal and Feedback Mechanisms in Biological and Social Systems, these cybernetic conferences combine the innovators of the physical and biological sciences with those of the psychological and social sciences to tackle the, quote, comprehensive study of man. Thus, the core Macy's group expanded to include Norbert Wiener, an MIT mathematics professor and child prodigy who earned his PhD from Harvard at age 17 and studied under mathematician and political philosopher Lord Bertrand Russell, author of the seminal book establishing the modern rules of logic. John von Neumann, the Hungarian émigré and member of the Manhattan Project, who had become a pioneer of the digital computer,
The electronic computer.
and who used game theory to analyze Cold War strategic thinking. MIT mathematician Walter Pitts,
Mathematics has been called the one universal language of mankind.
who was self-taught in logic and co-authored several key papers on brain modeling with Warren McCullough. Raphael Lorente Deneau of the Rockefeller Institute of Medical Research, who had obsessively chronicled the action potentials of neurons and noted their compatibility with electronic and digital systems. German émigré and Gestalt psychologist Heinrich Kluwer, who studied visual perception, hallucinations, and mescaline as an experimental physiological psychologist, and was best known for Kluver-Bucy syndrome, a cognitive impairment triggered by surgically created brain lesions. German refugee and Gestalt psychologist Kurt Lewin, an OSS agent and director of MIT's Center for Group Dynamics, who was closely associated with the Frankfurt School and Tavistock Institute. Editor of the Macy's Conferences, second-order cybernetician Heinz von Forester ran the Pentagon-funded Biological Computer Laboratory at the University of Illinois. Born in Vienna and part of the infamous Vienna Circle, von Forester studied physics and conducted radar experiments for the Nazis and subsequently the Allied occupation. McCullough arranged for his academic position, permanent stay, and invitation to the Macy's Conference in 1949 after reading his work on the molecular basis of memory as a function of quantum mechanics. Along with these key participants were about a dozen other core members, as well as a handful of invited guests drawn from key positions of expertise. Macy's guests included OSS and CIA asset psychiatrist Harold Abramson, who worked on top-secret chemical warfare projects at Fort Detrick, some of which were co-sponsored by the Macy's Foundation itself, and who had run multiple MKUltra projects involving LSD experimentation. Dr. Abramson is also known for introducing LSD to many of the Macy's conference attendees, including Macy's president Frank Fremont Smith and Gregory Bateson.
That's acid.
The attendees gathered together for 2 days at the Beekman Hotel, today a white-glove luxury condominium on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. The posh neighborhood may have seemed like an unlikely location, but not only was it next door to the Macy's Foundation, it was also just a few blocks away from the Council on Foreign Relations, which Allen Dulles had led for decades, and from the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research and Cornell Medical College, where Project MKUltra research funds were channeled into the Human Ecology Fund. Rather than be based out of Washington, D.C., the wartime OSS operated out of its headquarters in room 3603 of Rockefeller Center, working side by side with Britain's MI6 and in the same building as the Rockefeller Foundation.
This machine has stored program, and that is the thing which makes the computer revolution possible.
John von Neumann took the stage to update everyone on the progress of the digital computer during the war.
The immense strides in computer technology that were spurred by von Neumann's work.
It was now ready for the next stage of exploitation.
The system calls for the key to be either up or down. The code calls for a dot or a dash.
Norbert Wiener's cybernetic concept held the key as to what they should do with the digital computers they had developed.
The method and the signal are such that they must be fed to the transmitter in a series of positive decisions.
It fused together the working principles of the biological organism, looping systems that maintained equilibrium.
Its maintenance is automatic and seeks to balance any disturbances.
Wiener, Rosenbluth, and Bigelow presented the ideas of their paper, Behavior, Teleology, and Purpose. It was written in 1943, but couldn't be published until 1947 due to secrecy. They had a universal mechanism to create goal-seeking behavior that made machines and even people basically programmable. On the influence of a feedback system, Wiener stated,
"The existing natural reflexes are essentially part of the same mechanism that can inform all purposeful activity in automata. One need merely supply a circuit with receptors and effectors. Then they become goal-seeking devices."
Conference Chairman Warren McCullough had taken things a step further, showing how the operation of the human brain can be represented by on and off electric switching devices.
It is stop or go, on or off, one or none.
His 1943 paper with Walter Pitts on the logical calculus of neuronal activity introduced the concept of the neural net and showed how the communication of neurons could be modeled by a digital computer.
The mind, in contradistinction to brain and behavior, emerged in the 1950s as a legitimate object of experimental research. The Neural Nets project of McCullough and Pitts spearheaded this cognitivist turn in the 1940s. Science of mind thus became a science of signals based on binary logic. Neural nets bridge the gulf between body and mind, matter and form.
The comparisons between the central nervous system as an electronic machine and the digital computer as an artificial brain boiled down to questions of logic, mathematics, and the very nature of reality itself.
Very simply, in the first place, I wanted to find out what was going in the brain.
For McCullough, it was always an esoteric quest to find the nature of reality in quantifiable and technical terms.
Head of the Department of Cybernetics at MIT, psychologist, psychiatrist, neurophysiologist, engineer, mathematician, American, a confirmed eccentric, a genuine Renaissance man.
The first answers to his questions came during the tail end of World War I. Yale's wartime ROTC training instructor in chemical warfare was none other than Professor
Bertram Borden Boltwood, head of the chemistry department and an expert in chemical warfare.
Boltwood, who'd come from a wealthy family of skull and bones initiates, was on the front lines of discovering the inner world of the atom, and the first to discover evidence of radioactive decay of uranium and lead. A chosen initiate, Professor Boltwood invited young McCullough to his home to discuss the hidden history of science from its mysterious beginnings.
It was just before the Great War ended that he invited me to his home for an uninterrupted talk. He complained to me of his increasing forgetfulness and asked me to spend one evening, 5 p.m. to 5 a.m., with him to illuminate the larger picture. He grabbed me by the hands and intently revealed to me the hidden history of science from its mysterious beginnings.
Knowledge was passed down through the centuries and closely guarded by the initiates.
Between ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Phoenicians, Babylonia, and beyond.
All shared the mysterious keys to governing early civilizations.
Cybernetic at heart. These inherited secrets fueled the minds of the ancient philosophers and mathematicians.
Thereafter, priest classes, secret societies, and elite organizations of learned men.
After summing up this history of scientific progress, he paused. The room went silent. And he said, if you want to get behind the fake explanation of how our world comes to be as it is, then you must find the facts for yourself and accept nothing in addition but logic and mathematics.
In an interview years later with counterculture icon Stuart Brand, Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson admitted that McCullough constructed the meetings around a, quote, grand design, shaping who would speak and in what order over a 5-year period. When Brand asked Bateson what McCullough's grand strategy was, Bateson simply replied, "Who knows?" What was the common code between the communication of the nervous system and the computer's binary processing language? They wanted to show the effect of the physical world on the mind in statistical terms with data. Input, output. Eventually, all the entities will sync to the dominant, whichever is making the most accurate and reliable long-term decisions, whoever is setting the pace and the trends, which could carry out any number of simultaneous calculations and feed back into the mental loop.
Implied by this research was the hope for a technology for controlling behavior via the second signal system, using information inputs as causative agents rather than chemical agents, electrodes, or other more exotic techniques applicable perhaps to individuals rather than groups. C. This new trend, observed in the early post-Stalin period, continues. By 1960, the word cybernetics was used by the Soviets to designate this new trend. This new science is considered by some as the key to understanding the human brain and the product of its functioning, psychic activity and personality, to the development of means for controlling it, and to ways for molding the character of the new communist man.
The airborne computer is no longer a theory, nor an experiment. It's a fact. Tested, functioning, practical, and restricted. It has gone into production under the label brain.
Macy's was meshing the power of language, communication, and the symbolic exchange of information with the biological modes of control, sowing seeds in 1,000 directions.
A psychologist was involved in this experiment, along with a biophysicist and a physiologist.
This was the birth of personal computers, robotics, satellites, and artificial intelligence. From the very beginning, models created in the digital computer of the brain were also inversely symbolic of the mechanization of the mind, which might one day be conquered one neuron at a time.
As he finds the correct path, he registers the information in his memory. Jesus is an electrically controlled mouse. He has the ability to solve problems by trial and error means and then remember the solution. And something perhaps akin to a brain.
counterpart to Macy's. The Ratio Club was formed in 1949 in the UK. McCullough gave the keynote at the first meeting. Alan Turing, W. Ross Ashby, Gray Walter, and Donald McKay were among its most important members.
Now meet Dr. Gray Walter of Bristol. His mechanical tortoise has an electronic brain which functions like the human mind, sensitive to both light and touch. Dr. Walter says that his electronic toys work exactly as though they have a simple two-cell nervous system, and that with more cells they could do many more tricks.
But Gray Walter was more deeply involved in the study of brainwave activity itself.
Present-day radio and television techniques afford an opportunity to probe into the brain.
Mapping the relaxed states of mind characterized by alpha waves, and Walter was the first to experimentally produce changes in brain waves through the use of flickering light.
Now I'm going to flash a bright light at you. Keep your eyes closed, and please try not to move. That's good.
Gray Walter had also worked closely with Norbert Wiener, introducing him in the early 30s to the then mysterious field of brainwave interpretation.
For each stimulus to a sense organ starts not one, but a train of impulses which are easily followed electrically with a cathode ray or other oscillograph.
The discussion began at von Neumann's request, a conversation about consciousness as to whether there is an anatomical substrate for what has everybody knowing things. Von Bonnen held it was probably not cerebral cortex that determined awareness, but more likely something in the midbrain, and I suggested the importance of the thalamus. Fremont Smith went into the different degrees of consciousness from full attention through twilight states to sleep and hysterical amnesias. Molly Hauer described the stimulation of the cortex she witnessed under Dr. Penfield, which did not disturb the patients, yet threw them into a panic when stimulation caused vocalization resembling speech. The distinction between consciousness and awareness.
Members of the Macy's conferences, including Frank Fremont Smith, Margaret Mead, Clyde Kluckholm, Henry W. Brosen, and Molly Harwood, also sat on the governing board of the International Committee on Mental Hygiene.
Oh my God. Oh no, don't let them take me in there.
Headed by John Rawlings Rees, creator of the Rockefeller Foundation-funded Tavistock Institute and the British Army's chief psych warfare expert during World War II. Mental hygiene went global, and a massive conference was convened in London in 1948.
Can serve as a springboard for more meaningful discussion and think about the nature of the problem.
To mold the post-war New World man, starting inside his own head.
Because it enables the individual to fit into an orderly system. Being a member of an organized group offers a basis for emotional stability to every man.
Heavily funded by the British and American governments and the private philanthropic foundations, it almost seemed like a global Manhattan Project for the mind was kicking off.
But we all have our problems. You've got to pull yourself together, and this will all work out all right.
It culminated in a report authored by the Cybernetics Conference members, Lawrence Frank and Margaret Mead, and was titled Mental Health and World Citizenship, which focused on the modifiability of man and all of his social institutions.
They come from all sorts of homes, these patients, all kinds of backgrounds. But somewhere along the line, life became too much for them.
Political, economic, legal, and religious. His family, his school, and his workplace.
How wrong I was. Or no, not wrong, sick. And now that I'm well again, I can't help feeling just a little sad, the way you always do.
In order to influence and change the world's behavior, one human being at a time. It stated, quote, "The sciences of man offer the hope of a new approach to the problem of war and a world community, and it is the ultimate goal of mental health to help men to live with their fellows in one world, so that men can live together in peace with each other.
Reinforce shock treatment. Help Fred to draw away from his feelings of antagonism and suspicion and move closer to reality.
Because of this, they determine, quote, the goal of mental health has been enlarged from a concern about the development of healthy personalities to the larger task of creating a healthy society.
But whatever the mode of treatment, it's essential that it be supplemented by an atmosphere of security and calm. The effective hospital must always serve as a refuge for its patients, a place where they can live quietly during that period of reorientation in which they learn how to achieve a better adjustment to the world outside.
Out of the conference, a supposedly scientific World Federation of Mental Health was established. John Rawlings Rees left the Tavistock Institute to become its first president, a seat that both Fremont Smith and Meade would later fill as well. The group's motto, borrowed from the UNESCO Constitution, was, quote, since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed.
The problem became one of communication between man and machine, between machine and machine, between machine and man.
There was a large military presence at the Macy's cybernetic meetings. Perhaps not surprising given how many contracts its core members had with Naval, Air Force, and Army research, all of which were later exposed as routine fronts for CIA endeavors.
These meetings bring together field representatives, simulation data people with their background of environmental information, and military personnel, the ultimate users of the programs.
The Office of Naval Research had its own branch for investigating physiological psychology, basically another name for cybernetics.
Man, which we have put in between two already known machines. Man is a predictor and says, I shall continue to do whatever my last solution predicted will be right, so long as no detectable difference arises. I'm very curious to know just how far we can push this human operator.
Would you please describe?
In which part of the brain should they screw the spark plug? So we have the human operator surrounded on both sides by very precisely known mechanisms, and the question comes up, what kind of a machine have we placed in the middle? What kind of a machine is man?
The needs that power the human machine, that influence human behavior. Let's take a man. Any man.
Man the maker. Tools would give him control over his own world, organization, and extension, using strategy for dominance and survival.
You see, in the chain, the end man sends a message and then he has nothing else to do. He merely waits for the answer to come back.
Man splits into groups, tribes, cults of information, and behavior propagated through rituals.
The number of messages sent, of course, correlates highly with where you are in the group.
Clusters of knowledge, careful note of mysteries and breakthroughs, spilling forth in useful language, not open source, but guarded secrets of power.
If we play this game on paper, we get almost exactly the operation one gets with an actual group.
The modification of the synapse. Neurons that fire together, wire together. Hebb proved that.
I would like to follow that remark. When we were talking this morning, von Neumann was saying that the brain could not be an analog calculating machine, but must be a digital one.
A machine with an analogic part and a digital part.
So the analog part is able to create analogies that mirror observed actions in human beings with whom we communicate.
Such a device may also use data from previous experience to predict the future.
A tapestry woven from the memories of past sensations.
What are you? I can't tell where this is going.
Depends on where you walk to.
Curiouser and curiouser. What kind of place is this?
What I see when I look at you is, in fact, my image of you. Or you see your image of me. The how of using our senses is a deeply concealed body of knowledge. Very few people seem to realize the enormous theoretical power of this distinction between what I see and what is actually out there. Most assume that they see what they look at, but the map is not the territory. What gets from the territory to the map, i.e. from the outside world to the brain, is news of difference, motion for instance. If there is no difference in the territory, there's nothing to say on the map.
After creating his neural nets model with pits, the McCullough's MIT team would write what the frog's eye tells the brain. Perception. Our brains translated and converted analog symbols embedded in our sense receptors into digital data in our brain. It isn't reality that we see, but rods and cones interpreting the shapes and shadows and colors of the real world. For frogs, it meant an eye trained to see primarily flies and bugs, a worldview that was easily tricked and fooled by forms and puppets and other forgeries. Human senses were tricked by many things in the labs, along with practically every other animal species that had been tested.
Why do the two heads seem to change size? Answer, the windows are distorted.
Plato's famous allegory of the cave. Reality is nothing more than shadow puppets projected on the cave walls.
It goes all the way around. It's an optical illusion.
But even though you tell me, my eyes still won't believe it.
When you run circles around the military's technologically driven future, the nerves of the Army and Navy and Air Force, the communication networks of signals and intercepts of planes, tanks, boats, missiles, and torpedoes, when you run circles around the whole of human society and its various cycles of influence and modification, and when you run circles around the individual, circles around the problem of the machine and man himself. And once you go around and around the problem of feedback and the cycles of behavior, the responses of Pavlovian conditioning, perception, and reality, in the end, the whole of man can be controlled through his dependence on his environment. Because the mind is contained within the brain-body mechanism, and thus isolated from the outside world, it is entirely dependent upon information derived from the senses. In other words, the mind is already contained within a natural matrix.
Focused on communication, their main purpose of indicating to what extent science suffers from the babble of its many tongues, and hence how necessary it is for us to learn to speak again to one another.
The transmitter experiencing systems must operate message, channel, direct its function, see on-off knowledge of electrical impulse transmitted constant feedback information back into the message and delivered to the destination.
Many of the cybernetics members were now talking literally about constructing an artificial matrix.
A matrix is supposed to give birth, not receive. And yet what I want to talk about is very definitely the birth of a matrix. The matrix has been a growing thing, getting more and more complex, wider and wider in its scope, and, I believe, more and more fertile as time has gone on.
Pattern comes from pater, the father, a stamp. Then the papa is making again and again children of himself. What is a complementary to pattern? It's a matrix. Look at the matrix which embeds. Yes. So everything is sitting in one big thing embedded in a matrix.
As Alex Bavelis of MIT noted in his group dynamics studies,
We are attempting now to describe the operation of a net in terms of the probability that there will be a message from A to B in a given time period. We plot the net as a matrix. We put ones where there is a link, and zeros where there is no direct link.
At stake was the unveiling of an entirely new paradigm, one which encompassed a holistic view of control that could potentially govern the world and the mind. The system they came up with required that individuals and society be placed in a common communications network.
The eye of the beholder sees a strange new technology.
It all centered around man-computer symbiosis.
Things are going to be considerably better for a lot of people when and if we ever get changed over to an essentially electronic base.
As this network evolved, the internet developed into an artificial nervous system. Like other Macy's attendees, J.C.R. Licklider had been activated by wartime research. His experiments in modeling the human brain with psychoacoustic factors at Harvard overlapped with secretive contract work that revolved around how the human nervous system reacted to electronic stimuli.
Behavior tied to appetite was couched in the same terms as that for self-steering torpedoes and self-training guns.
Like so many computers, machines, and other controllable factors, man could be placed in a technical loop and his behavior modified.
Yes, I see. Do go on.
A psychologist and computer scientist, Licklider embodied the connection between cybernetics and Cold War air defense, which was largely based out of Boston and MIT. His presence at the 1950 Macy's Cybernetic meeting coincided with his move to MIT and the start of a pivotal but shadowy role in creating the militarized MIT Lincoln Laboratory, the SAGE radar network, and the DEW line, or Distant Early Warning Missile Defense System.
A radar early warning line north.
A system which relied upon the very command and control communication networks that Norbert Wiener and others at Macy's created. Ultimately, the nerves of the nation's defense were designed to operate like the human nervous system.
And so, headquarters, United States Air Force, arrived at a command and control concept with data processing as its nerve center. Its basic function, to extend the useful capacity of man's brain.
Switched to digital communication technology, aided and abetted by satellites. The melding of computers and communication.
A fact which influenced Licklider's vision for a networked and interconnected society.
And then to interconnect each of the computers to each other to form a fully connected network.
That would eventually culminate in the DARPA-created ARPANET, the forerunner to the modern internet.
Research now going on will someday permit a network user to log in. Will someday permit a network user to log in. Will someday permit a network user to log in. Will someday permit a network
The important thing to realize about systems is how they are controlled. And we must get rid of any notion straight away that control is something imposed on the system from outside. It has to be built into it. Let's see how the mechanism works. You see it lifting here, transmitting the message along here, lifting that cam up here, and then shutting off a valve there. That is built into the system. It's called feedback, and feedback is ubiquitous in control systems.
At this point, we realize that reality itself is not a fixed thing. As our nervous systems interpret the symbols and signals of familiar patterns and changes, continuously revising our image of the world. Thus, an artificial matrix is inherent, indeed unavoidable.
These systems which are minds are circuits of cause and effect. They are cybernetic systems. For me, the system is man and environment.
Man sought to control his own kind by way of understanding what governed his actions, starting with the neuron, base unit of mind-body communication.
What is cybernetics? A railway train needs no steering gear. The forces required to correct for the buffetings of wind and way are supplied automatically by sideways reaction of the rails against the wheel flanges. A ship, lacking such implicit means of guidance, requires a helm, normally controlled by a helmsman. The Latin for helmsman is jubinator. The Greek, kybernetes. From the first comes our word cybernetics, la cybernétique, to denote the science of government.
In the end, cybernetic modification of the human being makes information and its communication the key to control, making reality itself malleable, and our interaction with the technology at hand has created its own feedback derived from our interpreted reality.
The world about us is accessible only through a nervous system, and that our information concerning it is confined to what limited information the nervous system can transmit.
As this technology captures, measures, and analyzes the world around us, man is programmed and reprogrammed through continuous updates provided by this intermediary. And conditioning comes with it, along with new reflexes.
And, specifically, it is a recursive epistemology, and based upon recursiveness of cycles, returning all the time to bite their own beginnings.
Cybernetics programmed in this same base human language, self-reflexive cycles, feedback and adaptation. Our very essence is conflicted with the environment and yet dependent upon interacting within it.
Yet the old worm Ouroboros is an odd worm, who conceals not only his recursive nature, but also the implications of recursiveness.
The Ouroboros ist das perfekte Symbol für Kybernetik.
Ultimately, the underlying natural matrix is supplanted by an artificial one, born with the collective consciousness of mankind's total intent, goals, and purpose. Ultimately, they found that programming was easy enough anyway. The science of cybernetics would reveal to the CIA, or any serious agency making inquiries, that although the mind itself could not be directly controlled, it was in essence malleable due to its reliance upon physical sense data and man's unique ability to comprehend language and to talk. Behavior, then, modified by continuous feedback, was inherent in communication itself. The ultimate question was, who or what would control the signal? Reports from the first 5 of the 10 Macy's Cybernetics conferences were never publicly released. These 10 meetings systematically worked out questions of control that would have to be asked and could only be answered through experimentation, some of which would prove so unethical it could only be carried out under a blanket of national security on a need-to-know basis. The last cybernetics meeting was held April 22, 1953, just 9 days after Alan Dulles signed off on MKUltra. Norbert Wiener lamented,
Those of us who have contributed to the new science of cybernetics thus stand in a moral position, which is to say the least not very comfortable. We have contributed to the initiation of a new science which embraces technological developments with great possibilities for good and evil.
This was especially so since the computing machine had already reached a point of such complexity that it threatened man's freedom to make individual decisions.
We do not have a choice in suppressing these new technological developments. We can only hand it over to the world that exists about us. There are those who hope for the good of a better understanding of man and society that may anticipate and outweigh the incidental contribution we are making to the concentration of power. I am compelled to say that it is a very slight hope.
The speed of military and technological development in our century leaves no margin for guesswork, no time for the leisurely trial and error of yesterday.
Cyber evolved beyond the passive reception of one-way signals, as with television. Instead, it required a feedback loop of interaction.
Would you advocate a world ruled by scientists and by the super brains?
No. We are fit for discovering how the world works. We're not fit for telling other people what to do.
At a conference in 1968, shortly before his death, Warren McCullough remarked, "Man, to my mind, is about the nastiest, most destructive of all the animals. And I don't see any reason, if he can evolve machines that can have more fun than he himself can, why shouldn't they take over, enslave us, quite happily?"
We used to argue about whether a computer can think. The answer is no. What thinks is a total circuit, including perhaps a computer, a man, and an environment.
If you could control the environment,
All of the circumstances to which the individual must react to the environment in which he lives.
Similarly, we may ask whether a brain can think, and again, the answer is no.
He has to work by cycles of operation, very much like an ordinary mechanical computer. He does very many complicated things.
What thinks is a brain inside a man who is part of a system which includes an environment.
If you can get to the man at the switches, if you get to the man at the switches, then you can get to the real man.
Scientists are not interested in controlling other people. They're interested in finding out how the world really works. Now, look, I'm not even able to run a gang of 20 people, and I've had 50 under me. No. To run the world, no. No scientist is fit for that.